Okay, so welcome back to Default Global, where we chat with founders of global first companies and experts who help with global expansion. So today we're joined by Jan, who is a VP of Global Infrastructure at WorkMotion, that is an employer of record company based in Germany. So it is a pleasure to have you here, Jan.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today.
Sure, sure. So before we start, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do at WorkMotion?
Sure. So, as you said, my name is Jan. I joined WorkMotion in February of 2021, so
Mhm.
a bit more than 2 years ago. And at that point, it was still called differently. As with many startups, we changed names. It was a smaller, yet to be um, proven venture. And yeah,
Mm.
and I mean, my background is in management consulting. Before that, I also worked for a smaller German startup, helping them to expand to the US. And my role now is focused on building the employment infrastructure, the legal and the employment infrastructure that lets us hire talents worldwide for our clients. So what this entails is mostly 3 to 4 missions, as I would say. One is managing our employer of record partners because we do not have worldwide coverage with our own setup. So in a lot of countries, actually the majority of countries, right, because there are like 190 something countries out there, we work with local partner companies. So it's building the relationships with them and managing them. And then a big part is building our own infrastructure. So incorporating local subsidiaries in other countries, getting them ready to have all the licensing and banking set up ready, building then also the HR processes and getting the relevant HR vendors in place so that we can offer compliant employment. And then, and this is now an additional mission, so to say, once the basic setup is there, we're also working on expanding our benefit and extra services offering that's related to the HR setup and the services we provide to clients.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So, and now let's talk, a bit about the bigger picture. From your perspective, you've been in this industry as, like you mentioned, for more than 2 years. How do you think these global hiring trends are changing, and what I don't know challenges or opportunities might come up because of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, when I started in this industry, we were just finishing the pandemic, right? And of course, the pandemic gave one of the biggest boosts to what we do on day to day. And if you look back at it, I think the biggest benefit that enabled this, of course, was that people during the pandemic understood that not everybody needs to sit in the office, right? And then if somebody does not sit in the office, consequences, it doesn't necessarily matter where they sit, right? So if they sit still in the city where the client is based, where they have their headquarters, or somewhere else in that country, or even in a different country. So I think that is the biggest realization that enabled our business model, or gave it the boost that we saw over 2021, 2022. Um, and then I think the other trend, of course, is, and this is particularly true for Europe, that there's of course more and more shortage of skilled labor, especially in the fields of IT, um, uh, programming, software development, product management, and so on and so forth. And so those two trends basically go hand in hand, um, where you now see that clients say, "Look, I can't find the talent locally, so I rather look in a different country, um, because then ultimately it doesn't matter where the person is sitting." And so that was more, so to say, in the boom times that we saw in 2021, 2022. One of the biggest drivers was, look, I have funding if I'm a startup or a scale up, or I'm expanding if I'm an established company and I need these talents and I don't find them locally. So where do I go? I go to other countries because that's where I find these roles. The other big thing that we actually saw, or the other big driver that we saw in our data, was then also, again, a consequence of COVID. What you maybe saw in the US, a lot of people during the pandemic moved from New York or California to Texas or Florida, or even, I mean, I have some friends that moved to some remote states like Wyoming because you could work from anywhere. Of course, in Europe, that's a little bit trickier because you don't stay in the same country, right? But still, we saw that also as a trend that people moved from Germany, for example, to Spain, but still wanted to continue to work for their previous employer, right? And so that's where we came in and made that possible. Ultimately, now, and this maybe goes more to your question, what do we see now in terms of a shift of
Mm-hmm.
trends? Of course, now with the economic uncertainty that started to set in the last year, and now, of course, freshly off the printing press, so to say, a lot of uncertainty around banking and how the economy, especially in Europe, is developing. There's, of course, a renewed focus on costs, right? I mean, cash has a price now. Startups don't have these crazy funding rounds anymore that they had before. And so now, of course, everybody needs to see also how they work with every euro or dollar that they have available. And so now what we see is a bit of a reorientation and using maybe remote hiring more as an opportunity to improve budgets or to get the most bang out of your buck, so to say, instead of solving the talent constraint. In the long term, maybe, and this is what we're of course very much focused on, so looking towards the rest of the 2020s, we're convinced that the general shortage of talent will continue. So the trend that we saw prior to this current economic downturn will be the biggest driver, we believe, to clients and companies using this employer of record model to hiring talents abroad.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, and speaking about maybe short-term perspective, you mentioned like a long-term, but in short-term, with more talent available due to this recent, layoffs, specifically in the United States, do you think companies might shift towards local hiring instead of global hiring, since hiring was kind of originally meant to address talent shortage? And specifically in the tech sector in the United States, we see that there are tons of layoffs, and maybe it's a kind of not a trend anymore to go global. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, right? And so, of course, that's something we're taking a look at. But also, I mean, what I know to some extent from what we see as a company, but also from anecdotal evidence through friends and business partners, is that a lot of companies, even though they lay off in the US, they still might hire in other countries because you still can get the same kind of workforce even in Europe. So there's a lot of US companies actually that use employer of record services to now hire in Europe because they can get similar quality talent at a
Mm-hmm.
different salary level, right? And so I think this is still continuing. I think for certain roles, you will still find companies hiring locally now, right? Because especially as you said, now the kind of big driving factor of talent availability is gone. However, you really, really strongly have this factor of cost consciousness coming in. And so we see this, and this is no surprise. I mean, there was also, I remember a post by one of our competitors, CEO on LinkedIn around this, that in general, companies have started to offboard more, right? So there's more, and I mean, we see this also in our numbers, right? There's more companies letting go talents, right? And this is probably, I think, the biggest driver again is cost. So I think if you follow your line of argument, right, of course you find talent now locally, but it also comes at a certain cost, right? Salary levels in Central Europe or Western Europe or even in Eastern Europe have not dramatically dropped at this point, at least from what we've seen. So that there's still kind of a drive to maybe go to other places to find this talent within the constraints of the newly reduced budgets.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. And do you think that we have a kind of trend for replacement, maybe like, for example, if we take a look at, yeah, like a big tech guys in the United States, like a Google, Facebook, of course, there are tons of layoffs in those companies as well, but they're still hiring, And do you think that it's a kind of replacement, like when they just fire like guys who are cost a lot, and trying to replace them with with maybe guys from other countries who are at the same level of experience, but who just their expectations is kind of lower. Do you see this trend?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's of course always two kinds of replacements, I would say, right? I mean, one is driven by, pure cost, where you say, okay, it's the same role, and I now just look for this role in a different location. A lot of times that, or in other times, it might be driven by actual projects, right? Where a company says, look, I mean, this is, for example, when you look at Meta, right? Like there's a lot of projects that they discontinued. And for that reason, they let go of people that were involved in these projects. But of course, there might be new projects starting or projects that continue with a bigger scope, for which you then need to find different roles, right? So I think these are the two trends in terms of replacement. And I mean, we see this also, I mean, internally, right? I mean, this whole topic of, and I think it's quite interesting, right? Coming out of these kind of boom times of kind of cash basically being free, and, you can go into any initiatives and you just hire people like crazy. It never forces you to make decisions, right? Or to really clearly face the trade-offs. And so now, within WorkMotion, but also in a lot of clients, and frankly in the whole industry, or in the whole economy, you see this, that companies now are forced to do or to make decisions, right? If you go for A or for B, and because the constraints are much clearer, right? And so I think replacement is certainly happening. But it's either, a lot of times it's project driven, I would say, but then of course also, and this is the trend that we see also, there's of course the kind of cost replacement.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, and again, speaking about the current economy, right? So which countries and maybe specific roles seem to benefit the most from global hiring in today's economy?
Yeah, I think, I mean, generally what we see, the countries that are basically since my start at WorkMotion that I've seen booming is a lot of Eastern and Southern European countries. Especially Southern European is quite interesting, right? Because I mean, let's talk about, for example, Greece or Italy. You have, or even Spain also, you have a lot of young people that are well educated, but that might not find the job opportunities they look for that match their skill set locally, right? So what happened historically is either there was some sort of skill downgrading, right, where somebody who might have had a master's degree or even a PhD worked in a job that did not really fit their profile because they couldn't find a different opportunity locally, or they would immigrate to, let's say, Germany, the Netherlands, or the UK, right? And so this trend, of course, is kind of broken now with the opportunity of working remotely through an employer of record. And so again, right, now we see that a lot of these countries where you had kind of big outflows of people before actually are able to retain or even to gain back a lot of their citizens, or even to attract people from other countries, right? Again, I mentioned that there's certainly a lot of Northern Europeans or Americans that now say, look, I'm done with the weather here, or I'm done with the cost of living. I want to go south, right? And so that's where they then go, right? And a lot of these countries, of course, also realize this. I mean, I think just over the last 2 weeks, I saw on LinkedIn there were 3 announcements for countries now offering nomad visas.
Yeah, like Spain, yeah.
Croatia, and Greece, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so this, of course, goes into the same vein. I mean, this is not targeted at people from kind of Northern European countries or something, but for example, I mean, an American might want to work in Greece, or somebody from Asia might want to work in Greece. So this is all going into that direction, right? And so I think these countries benefit a lot in general. Then, of course, there's India is always, I think, a big benefiter of this, because just by the sheer size of it. And also, level of English, of course, is one factor that plays into the selection, right? So English education and general education in India is very strong. But what we also see now is, and this is maybe something that a lot of companies don't realize in the beginning when they go with EORs, or when they look into, which country am I going to hire in, is the importance of time zone, right? Because of course, if people are more than 3 hours apart in terms of time zones, a lot of times it makes communication and collaboration quite difficult. And so countries that we also see that do quite well now are South Africa, for example, right? Because it's usually on the same time zone or 1 hour apart from Central Europe. And then also some, in general, a couple of African countries like Nigeria and also Egypt, for example, because you have a really big or quite big, well, actually quite a big young, well-educated workforce that is also, has very strong English skills and very good technical skills a lot of times, right? So I always tell the story when I started at WorkMotion, I was very positively surprised, right? Like the first front-end engineer we hired was actually a lady from Egypt, who was sitting here or sitting remotely, of course, in front of her laptop with her headscarf and everything, but building our user experience, right? And so that was kind of a very positive experience that I hadn't imagined, right? Because usually, at least, software development is a more male dominated domain. And so maybe to the second part of your question, in general, in terms of roles that we see that are hired remotely, very, very strongly software development, the product management. So these are usually the constrained roles, I would call them, right? So roles that are always in demand, even in a downturn. And then the other roles that we also see are like the country-specific ones, right? So where some client might want to have somebody working on local marketing or local copy or even local business development, where they don't want to make the full commitment to a market yet. Maybe they're an e-commerce business, right? And they only need somebody that speaks the language locally, and it makes more sense to hire a Croatian speaker in Croatia than hiring that person in in Amsterdam, right? So that's, I think, those are the two kind of sets of roles that we see. What I thought about yesterday was actually, of course, maybe you saw that there was, of course, this announcement of GPT-4 now. The question is, of course, how relevant is software development still going to be in the future, right? Because, of course, if more and more is going to be driven by AI, doing a lot of the tedious coding work, not like the kind of higher level work, then of course the question is how much of this hiring will continue. But we're quite bullish that even in that scenario, you will still need technical talent, and it's just one of the roles that I think is worldwide is constrained, which as a consequence also, and this is quite interesting, is also probably one of the roles or a set of roles that is moving to most like leveling in terms of salaries on a global level. Of course, in the US, you still earn significantly more than in other jurisdictions, but I think the difference between like highest paying and lowest paying country is probably much less than for a lot of other roles.
Yeah, 100%.
So you could maybe argue even that, for a lot of software developers, especially like, in niche specializations, through EOR, it's becoming a truly global market,
That's
for the
true.
first time for, I guess, any role, right? I mean, this is the benefit of remote work and employer of record.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with you. Okay, so we talked about the most interesting countries in terms of going there, but if we are talking about maybe specific industries and businesses, are there any industries or businesses or business models or maybe specific roles where you kind of advise being very careful with global hiring? Any ideas about that?
So you mean that should rather not look into this?
Yeah, just being careful when they just
yes
go global.
Of course, and I think this is quite interesting, right? So of course, as a consequence of having a lot of people or a lot of roles that are connected to software development, there's of course also always this question of what happens with the product of the work, right? Because of course people use their own skill and work to create something, the IP, right? And how is that then moving to the client, and how does the client make sure that they retain ownership, right? Of course, this is always a question of like, what happens if the person is in the other country? How much ownership do I have of this? And so we particularly, and I think I could even confidently say, more so than many of our competitors, have put a lot of emphasis on developing a robust framework for IP transfer from the locally employed talents to the end client, right? So that we make sure that the end client ultimately is the recipient of the IP, and that there's also sufficient protection and confidentiality around this, right? Because of course, in a remote work setup, especially when the person is in another country, there's always the question of trust, right? I can of course control and also enforce certain things more effectively if the person is sitting next to me in the office. The question, of course, is then different when the person is in their home office, even within the same city or the same country, even more so than when they're abroad, right? So the topic of trust and confidence that rules are respected and safety of or ultimately the retention of the work product is guaranteed is super important, right? And that's why we also put a lot of emphasis on this. Beyond that, then, right, if you look at it, of course, there are industries that are regulated and industries that also might have a higher security interest in, retaining the work product or having control over what the person is doing, right? And so what we always say and see, and that's also where we a lot of times block, onboardings if clients are thinking about certain roles, is anything that is related to financial advice, insurance, the pharma sector in general, right? So anything that is under a very strict local regulation. I mean, regulation exists for a reason, of course, and that's to control and contain a lot of behavior that could go wrong. So that's where we're very careful with this, and also clients from these industries should be very much aware that which roles they're hiring. It's not like a financial firm cannot hire anybody through employer of record. Yeah. However, they need to be aware if these roles fall very heavily under regulation, or if they have are at the core of something that is security relevant, right? So if we have, for example, a company that develops security software or VPN software, for example, that's something where as a client I would look into do I want this role really to be in another country or not, right? It's a bit of accepting certain risks, but in general, I think there are a lot of roles out there that can fit into this model. And again, right, we're making sure that we also, through contracts and procedures, have the appropriate controls to enforce and make sure that the client ultimately is as protected as possible.
Okay. That was good. Okay. So, and finally, can you give a sort of advice, or I don't know, what are the top maybe 3 things companies should keep in mind before going global?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies in the first instance think about, the role, the salary, but what I've seen, at least in a lot of clients and also in general when friends start exploring this when they are in companies that they work for, or maybe companies that they have, is first, I think you need to be aware of what this means for your company, right? So it's a little bit of a reality check, so to say, of where your business is at the moment. So I would say it's almost like working through a checklist. So this would be number 1, I would say, going and looking into do I have does my business work in English, right? How does it work if all of a sudden, for example, most of my people are in the office together, but then I have like 3 people that I hire remotely in Vietnam, for example, right? So I'm mentioning Vietnam here because we actually had the situation in the very beginning when the pandemic was still on, that we were here in Germany and lockdowns were over, and everybody was going out, and we had a colleague in Vietnam who was still sitting at home under very strict lockdown, right? And so of course that causes a lot of friction and also almost cultural damage, I would say, if somebody feels excluded or from this participation. So something to be very careful with, right? So for example, how we are doing it now is we have kind of a hybrid culture, of course, but even I, for example, work from home most of the week, so that there's a little bit more of an equalization. And there are certain practices, of course, for being in the office and how to feel colleagues that are working remotely a little bit less well, it also depends on the person. Some people are fine with it. They're like, look, I sit here in, I don't know, in northern Italy, and that's what I chose, right? And I'm fine with it. But of course, there's certain profiles who might feel excluded in the setup.
Correct.
And I mean, there's also companies, and I remember this. I talked to a former colleague of mine who now works for a different company, and he told me, look, before we can use your services, even we need to make sure that that everybody, or that in every department we have at least one English speaker, you know. So there's a bunch of things to be aware of when you go that route, right? Also in terms of
Right.
now you have to deal with different cultures, and specifically also again the time zone topic, right?
Yeah.
So that would be number one, checklist of, is my business, or like, have I thought about what this means to hire somebody in a different country now? Number two, I think, would then be, and this is what we're working on a lot in terms of discovery and client education, is helping clients understand which countries might be suitable for them, right? So again, right, what am I looking for? Am I looking for mostly English speakers? Am I looking for technical talent mostly? Do I not look for certain experience in sectors, right? So I had a conversation for another medium the other day about Ukraine, right? I mean, you're Ukrainian yourself, so there's of course a lot of talent also locally available in Ukraine that has certain skill sets, right? So I think it's always a little bit helping clients to understand what skill sets do they need and what countries are they actually looking at, right? I mean, we've had these discussions with clients where some were like surprised that you can find English-speaking talent, for example, in Egypt, right? So it's a little bit like broadening the horizon, because usually, of course, a recruiting manager or even the hiring manager, they're very much focused on the local market and might have not even have explored in their mind the opportunities out there when you can go to other countries.
Yeah.
So that's number two, right? And then number three is, of course, the whole topic of salary levels. And so this is where it becomes really tricky sometimes, because if you come from a let's say from a German context now, and you're used to a certain salary level, you first have to really get used. I mean, for example, we tried to hire somebody in Switzerland before, and I was very much of course surprised what the salary level is there locally, right? Because it's significantly higher here. Yeah. At the same time, then also you always feel like when you go and hire in another country that has maybe a lower average salary level, that oh my god, like this is like, this feels too low, right? Even though the person might say, look, this is actually my expected or dream salary, and I'm happy with it. So, and having the right match here, right? Because of course, as a client, you don't want to overpay. At the same time, you also, for local standards, don't want to underpay, right? So this is always the fine balance. And so what we've also been doing in terms of features on our platform is to help clients with this exploration, right? Get to know some countries better, so they understand what skill sets and characteristics they can expect in that country, and then at the same time also help them understand what the local salary levels for specific roles are. So again, as a summary, those would be the three, right? Is my organization ready, or am I ready to understand what remote working or having remote workers in other countries means for me? Then the whole topic of which countries am I actually looking at for which skill sets or roles that I need, and the third one, then what are the appropriate salary levels?
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I guess it's very helpful, those kind of advice for those who have never who's never done this global hiring before. And I guess I agree with all three points that you mentioned, because most of my clients, they're looking at salaries as the first item, I guess, and that's completely wrong. So I 100% agree with you. Okay, Jan. So I guess that was my last question for today. Yeah, it was fun. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us today and sharing those valuable insights on global hiring trends. We would love to have you back on the show in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was fun. See you soon.
Thank you. Yeah, see you.